All right, welcome to April 16th, and this is going to be lecture 3. Lecture 2 would have been the TED Talk that you watched from Jonathan Haidt. And Jonathan Haidt's video may seem a little odd for some of you. I think a couple of you have already seen it, maybe some of the other classes that I've taught. I find it to be a helpful tool for us to think about in terms of the divide, because that's really what we're getting at the heart of in terms of our conversation regarding reconciliation and the systemic issues that we're going to be talking about over the course of the next week and a half, is that there is a divide within evangelicalism and within the church itself about what is the responsibility that we have to the other in terms of our reconciliation and justice making. Is it a moral responsibility that each person is held accountable simply for the decisions that they make, good or bad, and then, or is it a systemic issue that we need to worry about correcting? And really, this goes to the heart of what is the moral responsibility of the church. I mean, that question has to be, ethics enters into this. What is our responsibility to seek the right, good, true, and noble? And then in what ways do we engage that? It would be great, wonderful in fact, if we just had one answer about what the ethical posture of the church should be regarding racial injustice and prejudice and how we reconcile that. But much like society, that question is not cut and dry, plain and simple. The church has sought throughout the ages to develop a corporate, universal ethic, and we've struggled to do so. That struggle has moved all the way through the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century. There's been philosophical ethics throughout the Enlightenment period that wanted to try to assume upon humanity a certain kind of universal condition of ethical responsibility or moral perspective, and we've been challenged in our inability to come to that place where we can adopt one sole universal ethic. And so in terms of the way in which we engage the conversation of racial reconciliation, we're already operating at that kind of divide. Because within our congregations themselves, within the church itself, there are different perspectives regarding our approach to racial reconciliation. We've already witnessed that even within the black community itself. So we've talked about militant aggression and moral suasion, but we need to understand that when we start to talk about racial reconciliation, racial justice, racial equality, there are already divides that are shaping how we engage and the ways in which we have conversations about ethical discourse. And what I think Jonathan Haidt does, now Jonathan Haidt is an evolutionary moral psychologist, so he's not what we would call a faith-based more psychologist, right? So he's not going to come at this from the perspective of religious faith and Christianity. But what I think he helps us to do, despite some of the assumptions that he makes that I'm not sure I agree fully on, is he gives us categories by which to, at some level, make sense of the divides that exist within the very lives of communities and why we just can't seem to adopt or embrace a collective ethic or sense of moral responsibility in our pursuit of racial equality, racial justice, and racial reconciliation. And in that talk, what he talks to you about are what he calls moral foundation theory, in that humans have the tendency to, he identifies 5, which in his book becomes 6 moral foundations out of which people generally make their decisions. And he talked about that in such a brilliant way in the TED Talk, but I want to rehearse this for you just to kind of invite us to think more fully about what he's saying and the implications of how this might impact us as we move into our final lecture. He suggests that liberals, people who consider themselves progressive and liberal, tend to, out of the 6, focus on the first 2 of those categories, the harm, care, and fairness, equality questions. The primary motivators for progressive and liberals is the flourishing of humanity based upon equitable opportunity and care for those who are most vulnerable. That seems to lay at the heart of the progressive liberal agenda. And he wants to suggest it drives the conversations politically, ethically, and in our context, theologically. So when you start with this harm, care, and fairness, equality, then there seems to be an immediate shift to looking at the systems that create and perpetuate the kinds of injustices that harm people, or that create a sense of inequality or discrimination or injustice. And so there's a systemic bent in that. There's like, we feel like the best way to deal with the ills of society is by addressing the system. So if we could think in terms of an aquarium, liberal progressives would maybe suggest this, that the water the fish is swimming in is putrid, and it's created an environment and atmosphere where folks harm one another and great inequality and injustice exists. We ought to spend all of our time cleaning the water so that fishes can swim the way they were intended to swim. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Conservatives, on the other hand, according to Haidt, he would suggest that though they focus on all 5 channels, they really focus on the last 3. They seem to emphasize the 3: authority and respect, right? Decision of rule of law, we might even suggest, in the powers that maintain that rule of law. Loyalty, in-group loyalty, who we believe we're a part of, and our responsibilities to them, our personal responsibility to those groups. And sanctity or purity, making decisions that protect the sanctity of life, okay? So conservatives would often seem to suggest, not in exclusion of, or not ambivalent to completely to the waters that the fish are swimming in, but really the responsibility is upon the fish themselves to make the right kinds of decisions that will cause them to flourish and perhaps even participate in the cleaning of the water. No one ought to wait for someone to clean up the water for me. I am responsible to be a part of cleaning the water through the decisions that I make, through the rule of law that I follow, through my loyalty to a group of people, for instance, an ideology or an assumption about our nation, whatever that looks like, and the preservation of a sense of purity and sanctity. So, but that tends to, not always, but often, tends to lead us toward a more individualistic, volitional, willful set of choices. So within Haidt's discourse, I think we have at least some categories to try to understand why in my congregation, when I speak about racial injustice, certain people will say, why are you talking about that being the church's responsibility? Each person needs to make decisions that are based upon love of God and love of neighbor, and people who consider themselves constantly victims. Rudy, that didn't help me right now. I'm recording, buddy. See, this is what I deal with working at home. I've got a dog that jumps on my lap, and right now everybody is no longer paying attention to my lecture, and they're going, oh, look at the cute dog, right? Yeah, because that's the impact that you have on my lectures when you jump in there. See you? That's you right there. That's you, Rudy. Okay? Can I finish my lecture, please? I love you. Can I go finish my lecture? Get down. All right, he had to come say hi. Back to what I was saying. So I think Jonathan Haidt gives us a helpful set of categories so that when we're in our congregations, we start talking about racial reconciliation, you're going to have some who will say, the system's broken, the system's unjust, people are being discriminated against. You see this in all sorts of areas: education, housing, the way in which underserved communities work and function, food deserts, redlining, and we need to fix those systems. And you'll have another group of people say, hold up, we ended racism. That's not a societal issue any longer. We passed the Civil Rights Act. We were making good ground. You can't play the quote-unquote race card. And it's not about the systems. It's about people making better decisions. And as people make better decisions, they will correct their situation. That breeds trust, and that reconciles people with one another. And so it's not about a systemic injustice, it's about moral responsibility based upon the kind of categories and framework that I think Jonathan Haidt helps us to start to think about in terms of the difference between progressives and conservatives, about even within our own congregations. So what I've hopefully done here is at least helped you by explaining a little bit more about what Haidt is talking about in the TED Talk that you watched, in helping us to think about where those divides come from. Now we're going to move then into a little bit more of this conversation in regards to specifically racial reconciliation in the last lecture.